Friends and travelers, however you've arrived, I bid you welcome. Here at Let's Be Frank, we're about lives, and above all, living well. But I don't suppose a podcast hosted by Benjamin Franklin could be about anything else. In my lifetime, I pursued the practice of moral improvement like a science, recording my successes, and yes, oftentimes reveling in my failings. It's my hope, with our weekly almanac, to deliver to a curious world delicious morsels of history in quick, easy to digest installments, perfect for a sit in your favorite chair or a morning walk to work. At the end of each installment, I like to wrap it up in a neat little lesson you can apply to your own life, taken from the events, stories, and personalities shared in each episode. So sit back, relax, and together, let's make history.
Greetings and salutations, dear listener. Welcome to another installment of Let's Be Frank, an auditory almanac for the curious mind, with me, your faithful friend and host, Dr. Benjamin Franklin, printer. Follow B. Franklin Live across our social media platforms, B. Franklin Live at TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube. Like us on Facebook at Let's Be Frank, an auditory almanac for the curious mind, and subscribe to our printing partners, Primary Source Media. Their YouTube page is /primary source. If you love the wit and wisdom of Let's Be Frank, please consider joining our Patreon. Join an ever-growing community of history lovers and take part in the content that's being produced every week. Speaking of which, my beloved Junto, this week debuts a new series specifically for the members of our Patreon that I'm calling This Past Week. What was Dr. Benjamin Franklin doing 250 years ago to the day? And so at the beginning of each installment, I'm going to talk about a letter, a primary source that Ben Franklin wrote 250 years ago as a supplement before we get to the meat of today's installment. Today's installment of This Past Week features a letter to Peter Collinson in the 1760s. The Parliament of Great Britain was determining what economic resolutions they could put forward to pay off their debts against the French and Indian War, and began to put forward policies that, let's just say, my beloved Junto, left this humble printer quite concerned. In a letter to Peter Collinson, Franklin talks about American trade and American industry. He begins to speak of what possible opportunities exist on this side of the Atlantic and what might take place if the British government continues in their capitalistic monopoly on the various goods they were sending to the colonies. If you're interested in hearing this primary source, please join our Patreon. With that out of the way, we can get to today's installment. For purposes of good order, this podcast is composed of several sources associated with Ben Franklin's life, knit together to collect it all into one narrative on a cohesive theme. Today's installment is about the dress we adopt, where it comes from, and the story it tells to a wider world. It's been said, my friends, that clothes make the man. In the modern times, we live in an era of fast consumption in the clothing that we wear. We change it seasonally. When we wish a new garment, we may simply run to the nearest store. But that was not true in my time. While clothing was a necessity, the process of procuring them was an expensive one that everyone took part in. I sat down this week with a historic tailor to speak about fashion in my time, how it separated class, and more than that, how it united people. Now to introduce him. Michael McCarty is a clothing historian and trained historic tailor. He studied under Mark Hutter in a 7-year apprenticeship at the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. While mostly focusing on the 18th century and early 19th century, he has recreated clothing from the 5th century BCE to the 20th century, using the appropriate technology of each era. His work has been displayed in museums throughout the United States and the world. Please join me in welcoming him. Mr. McCarty, thank you so much for joining us on Let's Be Frank.
Good to see you.
It's a pleasure to see you as well. Now, you and I, sir, have been friends for some time, but I wonder if you could tell the members of our junto what you do and what got you involved in the very unique line of work and vocation that you have chosen.
Well, since 2012, I've been working for the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation as one of their historic tailors. This is working in front of the public as well as behind the scenes, researching, adding to the body of knowledge of textiles and clothing in the 18th century, both within the colonial capital of Virginia, the city of Williamsburg, but also, of course, 18th century America, the Caribbean, and of course, England and throughout Europe in the 18th century. Um, you and I met all the way back then. We had our orientation training together. Uh, and so it's great to have you as a friend for that long.
Oh, yes. If I remember correctly, it was over a decade ago that you fit me for the first pair of buckles on my shoes prior to our grand initiation into this 18th century
That's right.
experiment. So, for a number of years now, quite a number of years, you have been one of the historic tailors at that museum and institution. Can you talk to the members of our junto about what that work entails, what it involves, and indeed what it's like?
Colonial Williamsburg has a really incredible opportunity, both for those of us as employees there, as well as for the guests that visit every year, within its historic trades department. Um, the department has over 20 different historic trade shops, all demonstrating the trades of the 18th century, but also, and demonstration is also practicing and studying those trades. And so in 2012, it was in August of 2012 that I started my apprenticeship. All 20 or over 20, some 23 now different trade shops. The people working in those shops have gone through or are currently going through a formal apprenticeship. It was a 7-year curriculum that I went through under the master tailor of the shop to catch me up onto speed as to what the program had learned so far, but then also to continue the education, the practice of the trade. Um, and both in the trade in the 18th century, being familiar with construction of clothing even in the 17th century, and then into the early 19th century as well. So giving a broad context of the history of the 18th century tailoring trade, which was the largest trade in just about any urban environment in the 18th century. Now, we so often think of clothing, or at least I often think people have the idea of clothing as kind of secondary in history. It's costumes. It's it, it's not something that really is affecting the daily lives, other than it's something that people are wearing. And I like to push people to think a little bit differently about it. That the clothing, in many ways, are one of the earliest things, or first things that people think of in the morning, um, and that it's the fashions of any time period, whether it's high fashion, whether it's trendy fashion, whether it's common working clothing fashion. This is a huge driver of society. And that's really, it's these type of economic ideas of clothing that really brought me to Colonial Williamsburg. Because I think it's something that isn't discussed enough. That clothing, when looking at antique pieces today, they're placed in museums and looked more as kind of artistic curiosities,
Hmm.
not as art pieces, but that they were more of a form of costume that someone wore to play a role. Which certainly all clothing, in a way, you could say that that it's all a part of us playing a role that we choose. But looking at all of those things connecting together is something that just inc- absolutely fascinates me about 18th century clothing, and I think why I'm so drawn to that century more than any other.
So let's explore it a little bit more. And something you were talking about a moment ago reminded me of what Dr. Mensmer, last week's guest, talked about with John Bartram. John Bartram, in compensation for certain actions he did with my friend Peter Collinson in gathering native plants, was paid in a new set of clothes, which demonstrates, I think, the point that you made, that clothes were not not just a commodity for the average person, but a luxury in many regards, a chance to define yourself, and for that reason, prized significantly more than perhaps they are in your modern time, where the accessibility and generality of clothes is somewhat increased. So let's talk about clothing in the 18th century, the practice of the 18th century tailor. And I will invite you to go at length to discuss the entirety of it in whatever direction you will. But what was clothing in the 18th century, the process of having clothes made, and how did we evolve to adopt some of the fashions that perhaps our listeners are seeing recreated and demonstrated in the media today?
I don't think of clothing in the 18th century as a luxury. It's a necessity,
Hmm.
right? That we generally don't have most men going about naked, and
Have you read some of the sources about how I've conducted myself in my life, Mr.
yes,
McCarty?
well, in society, people are generally not going about naked. That uh, from earliest civilization, man has clothed himself for protection, from work, from biting insects, um, from the sun, from the cold. And so clothing has always been a necessity. But clothing in many ways has been costly, whether that's in energy of hunting an animal, of skinning it, of preserving its hide and skin and fur for clothing, from the construction of clothing and the expenditure of both physical energy and mental energy to create something that fits on the body. It doesn't hinder movement. Um, and so we as human beings have been working on this for a long time. That the earliest sewing tools, the earliest needles that could be used for sewing date to at least about 60,000 years old. This shows that this is something that we as human beings have been doing for a very long time, and equally long, we've been using that clothing to ornament ourselves. So not just for protection, but also to ornament, to decorate ourselves, to create an identity within a group. Also within that group, for us each to perhaps set ourselves apart in that group from other individuals. So this, in a way, is kind of costume theory, clothing theory, um, from its earliest uses to today. How do we, as individuals, use clothing? How do groups use clothing? Um, and in the 18th century, we're seeing a time where people do have the ability to choose. At least looking at the large free population in 18th century America. But I think even before we look at the tailor or other clothing makers of the 18th century, we have to look at the textile industry itself.
Hmm.
The textile industry has nearly always been where some of the earliest um, mechanical inventions are seen, uh, making things easier, quicker, finer than human hands might do on their own. Maybe only other place where we might see that this type of regular invention throughout human history is in work in the fields and like plow technology. Um, but textile technology is in the 18th century, whether they be looms or spinning technologies, were rapidly increasing. A lot of this is due to the growth of population, especially throughout Europe and in England in the 17th century and in the early 18th century. Um, Following the Great Fire of London in 1666, we see a relaying out of London, and we see actually the city rebuilding, and we see rapid expansion of uh, or rapid shift of population into London and around London, and in other cities that become industrial sites in the 18th century. Um, there's a variety of things that bring this about, but a big thing that starts shifting people into England is a variety of acts that become known as the Enclosure Acts. These are passed by Parliament, and they take away public lands throughout England that were really kind of for free use by the general population in that area. Since most, if not all, people were working in England for landlords as tenant farmers, it was this public land that many of these poor tenant farmers would use to grow crops, graze animals, livestock. I mean, they could do so without having to pay a tax to the landlord, or not necessarily, it's the equivalent of tax, to pay a rent to the landlord, um, or to the local government. And this is how many people were able to survive and make a living. But what these enclosure acts did was they took away that public land, turning it over to large landowners to really increase the raising of sheep for wool for the wool industry. The idea being is that since the textile industry was growing in England and was quite large in the 17th century, that by having more raw material, specifically from the sheep that would be grown on those free lands or previously free lands, that would create more jobs, and that would in fact do better for everyone. To the general population in the late 17th century, early 18th century, this is kind of reverse Robin Hooding. It's taking from the poor and giving to the rich. There are many songs throughout the late 17th century and 18th century, songs and poems that talk about this. But what it forces a lot of the population to do is they can't afford to live in those areas without having use of those free lands. And so the families start leaving these ancestral homes that they had been at for generations and going to where there's work, which are these growing urban centers that are with more people there. You can now have industrial centers. Greater London is a big place of this. Nottingham, Norwich, Birmingham and Sheffield, centers of metal industries. And as you get greater population, you can now start dividing out the work, get separation of labor. Instead of having one person trained to do all the steps, you get trained to do one step. This takes less time. You also don't have to pay that person that much. By the 1730s in England, this has brought along the Industrial Revolution. In American history today, often we think of the Industrial Revolution as being the 19th century, the 1820s, 30s, 40s. But England really sees this Industrial Revolution due to this growth in industrial centers in the 1730s, 1740s. And nowhere is this more apparent than in the textile industry. By the mid-18th century, they're saying then that the textile industry is employing 1/3 of the entire population of the British Isles. It is 1/3 the gross domestic product of England. So fabric is big business. Most of this fabric is going to be fabric for the working class, because that's what the majority of the population is, and that's what their great demand is. This is a working population, which means they're wearing clothing that's getting worked in and worked out of. It needs to be affordable. But with an employed class, you also have people that are able to buy clothing, not just that they need, but also some things that they want. And so that's a huge part of the market as well, these mid-range fashionable goods. This is the consumer revolution that we're still into today, a growing middle class and people's demand for stuff that's starting to grow the economy. This is very true in 18th century America. When we're looking at the free white population of the American colonies, you're looking at a staunchly middle class society. It's the enslaved population that serves as the unskilled workforce. And even the poor white subsistence farmer in 18th century America is doing quite well compared to those over in England doing basic tenant farming. And so they're able to buy the things, as I said, the things that they need and going on to buy the things that they want. Textiles were over half the value of all imported goods to the colonies. Huge amounts of fabrics are being brought in. Any retail establishment within the colonies is selling fabric. Within the city of Williamsburg, which was not a large city. In 1775, there's less than 1,900 people, but there were a dozen tailor shops, 24 or more general merchant storehouses all selling textiles, milliner shops and haberdashers selling textiles. And there's even some taverns in town that occasionally will advertise that they've come into some fabric. And if anyone's interested, they can come and inquire there to have it. So fabric was everywhere. But in its cost, it's still relatively expensive, at least compared to what it is today. Today, in the 21st century, clothing is cheaper than it's ever been in human history. This is due to both the subsidization of the petroleum industry for fabrics like polyester, so plastic-based, but also the fact that there's global competition. And so the majority of textiles produced in the world today are coming out of China or elsewhere in Asia. And of course, there's all the technology and the automation of the industry as well. In the 18th century, until the very end of the 18th century, there's little to no automation within the textile industry. But as I said earlier, there are great steps forward that are leading up to the eventual rapid increase of technology at the very end of the 18th century. The first water-powered loom will be 1786. The first steam-powered loom, 1804. And automated spinning is coming around at that same time as well. But ultimately, this fabric must be affordable. As I said, men cannot be going around naked. They need to be able to afford that clothing. So the fabric must be affordable, and then also the labor of those people turning that clothing into, or that fabric into clothing, must be affordable as well. 18th century individuals are going to be spending significantly more of their yearly wages on clothing than we do today. Clothing today in the 21st century is cheaper, but they're spending their money in different ways. There were certainly those in the 18th century that were valuing their clothing more, that were taking better care of it. And we know of plenty of people in the 18th century that weren't taking any care of it. And that doesn't seem in any way to be associated with class, like that the wealthy people had the ability to not care about wasting things. Now, we certainly see records of the lower sort, the poorer sort, that are kind of tossing their clothing onto the floor and walking upon it, not caring about it. But we also know that there's individuals that are incredibly careful in their clothing. And so we need to be careful about broad generalizations, and in many ways it's kind of same as the human experience with clothing today. In the realm of value, clothing definitely held its value in a way today. Today, when you might go buy a garment, even if it's a fairly expensive garment, once you've taken possession of it, it holds a very little value, a very small fraction of what you paid for it. Yet in the 18th century, it most certainly did hold more value, closer to the original purchase price.
Can you talk us through the process of acquiring a new set of clothes by class? So what I mean by that is, say, a member of the gentry class, how they would go about acquiring a new set of clothes. Then perhaps of a middle class person, how they would go about acquiring a new set of clothes. And then finally, an enslaved or indentured servant. The distinctions that take place between those acquisitions. I imagine every person was not going into a tailor shop getting fit and measured for a new set of clothes, but I'm curious regarding those distinctions of clothes that are ready-made versus made and tailor-made to the individual, and how those distinctions were separated. How did clothing and how was clothing utilized to demonstrate to the world who you were and where your place in society was?
This is what's really exciting about the tailoring trade in the 18th century, is that it truly is the everyman trade. There isn't really a more democratic trade out there. That whether you were rich or poor, free or enslaved, native or newcomer, you would be the customer of a tailor. Well, there might be a luxury in the 21st century to be measured and have something made to fit you and only you. In the 18th century, that's just how, for a man, his coat, waistcoat, and breeches were made. So whether it was an enslaved man working in a house or in the field, the tailor still measures him for his breeches and waistcoat, his jacket or coat. But so does the governor of Virginia or His Majesty the King. They too are measured by a tailor, and their clothing is made for them. When it comes to going to the tailor shop or the tailor coming to you, we see both cases happening at all levels. Whether it's the tailor traveling out to the slave quarters of a plantation to measure the workforce, and then going back to his shop to do the construction of the clothing, or going to visit the governor in the palace. The tailor can travel to anyone, but also those customers might come to the tailor shop as well. So there's nothing there that quite divides the customers. But there are things that do. The wealthiest within 18th century America, and those who dealt directly with England. So their wealth is coming from the sale of goods to England, or their trade with England. So large-scale merchants that are dealing with England regularly, planters, and farmers that are shipping goods over to England, selling them in England. Their money is in England. And so having a tailor measure them locally, but then having those measures sent over to England and then have their goods made in England. But this is purely economics. They're not allowed to pull out large amounts of 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 cash, of coinage, and bring it back, bringing it out of England. That's very much discouraged, and so they're incentivized to spend that money in England. And so in that case, as opposed to dealing with a local tailor, where you're dealing with them face to face, talking with them what you would like, how you want it to fit, this then gets written down in letters, either directly to the tailor or to the individual's agent or factor, giving them instructions to then go to a tailor. And so we have a lot of these letters that survive from individuals, whether they're George Washington, who first has his first set of clothes ordered when he is 19 years old, to Virginia planters like Robert Beverly. And we can see through decades of letters his preferences in tailors and boot makers, leather breeches makers, hatters, and how those change over time, or how those tradesmen either maybe pass on over time. So he had a great shoemaker. The shoemaker dies. He's got to find another one. But to think that these wealthy individuals, because we have the records of them writing out exactly what they want, had more agency in what their clothing looked like than the common Virginian tradesman or farmer, is really not correct. We just don't have those records because they were communicated face to face with the tailor, and so they are still having clothing made to their taste. We even know of enslaved individuals within the city of Williamsburg, who are of fairly high level within the household, acting as butlers, as secretaries, ladies' maids, that were given the ability to choose clothing for themselves. What's also interesting at all of these levels, from the royal family all the way down, that inheriting clothing is not uncommon. It is not viewed as just receiving some dead person's clothes. That inheriting clothing or being gifted clothing is something that we see regularly throughout the 18th century. Remember, it gets back to the idea that this clothing holds its value, and receiving a garment basically is the same as receiving fabric, because you could take that fabric or that garment to a tailor and have it refit to you, maybe updated in style, and it's your clothing. That the material holds value in the garment, and that's having it remade is not that expensive. Today in the 21st century, having a garment altered to you, it doesn't really make sense. It's an expensive proposition if you can even find a local tailor to do that alteration work. Yet that's not a problem you're going to have in the 18th century. The work is affordable. Tailors are plentiful, and so to receive clothing is certainly something we commonly see from higher to lower. So from master to servant, we see clothing regularly being given secondhand from father to son, and of course, just like today, from older brother to younger brother, passed down within a household. So we certainly see that as well. Where things really differ, though, is in the fabric. That massive textile industry produces a great diversity of textiles. Ultimately, what determines the price of clothing is not the maker, but the material that the customer has chosen to have that clothing made from. The fabric, the lining, the interfacing, the buttons, even the thread that it's sewn with is chosen by the customer, provided to the tailor in most cases, and then the tailor is simply paid for the labor of the making of the garment.
Remarkable. So in your time, Mr. McCarty, are there examples in the various mediums that demonstrate to you particular excellence in the accuracy of not only clothing, but the processes and norms that you talked about today? Have you seen the new series, Franklin, the portrayal of yours truly?
Yeah. So I have seen the first episode and half the second. I think just half the second, maybe a little bit more. Um, uh, I would not say that it is a great representation of the clothing of the 18th century, but the show is very entertaining. And the art department has certainly made choices to help to speak to our modern audience and modern expectations and help to tell the story. And that's certainly necessary. That to present things or to costume any production today completely historically accurate might not convey the story in the way that the audience would expect.
That's a remarkably political and politic answer, Mr. McCarty. Well done. My compliments to you. So, what are there any presentations in your memory that have demonstrated it very well, or is this just a pitfall that comes from recreating specific historic instances?
I mean, well, of course, in any productions I was getting to with Franklin, is that ultimately there's two different things. There's how accurate is the clothing to its time period, to its location, um, uh, but then there's also how well does the art department, the costume designer, um, how well does their designs and their work help to support the story
Hmm.
being told. Um, classic Amadeus from the 1980s. It won Best Picture. Won Best Costumes. The Oscar for Best Costumes. But and the costumes are wonderful in telling the story. But in the realm of accuracy, they're not great, and in some cases almost absurd. Um, but there are productions that are quite good. Um, for the menswear, the Marie Antoinette film done by Sofia Coppola has excellent menswear, but part of that is because many of the waistcoats that were being worn by the men there were original from the 18th century. Um, and it was cheaper for them to buy originals than to have them made, have them reproduced. And so we saw that they seem to be used under great care, um, but uh, that does a pretty good job in the overall cut of the French court at the time. It's not perfect. Of course, one that's probably often lauded as being probably the most historically accurately costumed production, historical production, um, is uh, Master and Commander. But that's a fairly tight costume production, being set mostly on a single ship, um, and and is very well done. It's not perfect, and the clothing was definitely there are definitely things there that were chosen to help tell the story. See, a captain running around his ship in boots is not the safest or most practical thing to do, and probably wasn't done often in the period, but it looks cool. So of course you've got to put the captain in boots. Uh, Not something a
Remarkable.
sailor would actually choose in the 18th century,
The
yeah,
things we do
or
in
early 19th
order,
century.
the things we do in order to look dashing. Now, my final question, Mr. McCarty, is for you. Now, what is it about studying history and doing this work that sets you on fire and ignites your passions?
I love the technical work so much. Getting to study, I've spent countless hours studying hundreds, thousands of original garments, including the only known suit to survive from use. At the Smithsonian, they have a suit of clothes. Once was a lovely shade of rich purple, um, uh, and it tells a story, and it was a suit of clothes that was gifted to a man from Franklin in France, um, but made its way back here and eventually to the Smithsonian. And in looking at these garments, I don't just see the work of the tailor, but you also see the wear of the individual, and that's what I like to challenge myself to look at this as clothing, that it's the same as the garments that I chose for myself today, that this is something that someone chose, that someone made. It is something that speaks volumes of the society at large, but also of the individual. And in that, they're deeply personal items. And that just really excites me. That this clothing tells so much more than we often give it credit for. That I think the first, as I said, the first thing we often view it as is just as an artistic piece. And that often the work that goes into the making of it is just viewed as just incredible artisanal craft work. But the reality is it was trade work. So just like we would hope that today that any work done by an electrician or plumber in our home should be done to code, should be done what's expected, that it will work for decades, that it will work safely without causing any issues. The same thing's true of the work of the tailor in the 18th century, that we didn't view our work as an artistic expression, but simply as a way of making money. This is how so many individuals earn their livelihood. And so in looking at the work as how do you do this work at the industry standard of the period at a speed that was expected so you could make a decent living, that's what absolutely fascinates me as well. And challenges me to when I am recreating garments, that I'm thinking about the production, not just mimicking the work, but mimicking the order of operation and often the speed at which the tradesman might have done that work originally.
Incredible. Mr. McCarty, thank you so much for sharing and explaining the great weave that is the fabric of our past. I look forward and hope the next time I find myself in the fair city of Williamsburg to raise a glass with you, my dear friend. It's a pleasure to see your face.
Pleasure talking with you.
Now, what lesson can we derive from today's installment? I will be quoted as saying that one must eat to please thyself and dress to please others. All of us endeavor to tell a story in how we dress ourselves and how we demonstrate who we are to the world, not only with our clothing, but upon social media platforms and indeed in conversation. The lesson for today's installment is to be consumers of the things that ignite our passions, that make us fall in love with our chosen truths and understand the world better. And having consumed those things, the further lesson, my friends, is to put one's own goodness out in the world, to dress oneself in their individual virtues, their wisdoms, their truths, and in dressing well, make the world better. That's all for today's installment. Would that we had more hours in the day, but as always, we have nothing but time between us. Resource materials and images from this week's episode can be found in the journal section of bfranklinlive.com. If you like the show, subscribe to stay up to date with all the latest gossip, and do me the kindness of leaving a review. And, my beloved Junto, spread the word. Tell your friends, tell your family, tell your neighbors, tell your horse, I don't care. Let's make our intellectual Junto grow. And now, my friends, our time together has come to an end. Fare thee well, and always remember, when you are good to others, you are best to yourselves. Until we meet again, I remain your humble and obedient servant, Dr. Benjamin Franklin, printer. Stay curious, my friends.